Today's daf is daf Gimel, and we'll pick up where we left off at the very bottom of daf Beis Hamid Beis Michti, two lines up from the bottom. And Rabbi Yehuda had two brisos which contradict each other about the issue of an individual who relied on Bezdin, and Bezdin had issued a mistaken hora, a ruling, and the question is whether or not this individual is chayv achatos if he relied on Bezdin. Michti travayu stometnan, although you have indicated that both brisos, one brisa says that he's potur because he relied on Bezdin, the other said no, since there was no power helim dovishal tzibur, and he's acting as an individual, maybe he's somewhat negligent because he could have checked it out, and he's chayav, but the Mai de Kamais Rabbi Yehuda Vasraisa Rabbanan. The Gemara now attacks Rabbi Yehuda and says, how do you know that the brisa that says that he's potter is Rabbi Yehuda, and the brisa that says he's chayav is Rabbanan? Maybe we could say just the reverse, meaning there's no names indicated in the brisos. How do you know who holds what? And the answer is that man shamet le dedarish miute ki hai gavna. Rabbi Yehuda is assumed to be the one who has this unique kind of approach to darshaning, and we had a mute in the pasuk, and from that mute we derive the conclusion that there's no chiv chatas in a case of an individual who relied on the erroneous ruling of the Bezdin, and the drasha was from the pasuk v'im nefesh achas techta b'shkoga basosa, and he has a triple mute here. He's got achas, he's got nefesh, he's got basosa, shlosha miyutim. We only covered and studied two out of the three, but one out of the three is telling you hosam mipiatz l'chai baros bezin potter. And that approach, that kind of methodology of drasha, is typical of Rabbi Yehuda. And where do we find this? Desanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and here we start our daf for today, daf Gimel. Zos Toras ha'ola hi harelu shlosha miyutin. And Rabbi Yehuda sees in this pasuk no less than three different miyutim. We have the word vizos, then we have the hey of ha'ola, and then we have the word hu. And this pasuk in Vayikra Vav says Zos Toras ha'ola hi ha'ola al mukta alam mizbeach kol halayla v'gomer. And the pasuk teaches us that although the avoda is done by the kodim during daytime, but there are if the avoda started during the day, there are parts of the ola that could be on the mizbeach during the night and burned through the night. And if you have a carbon that the zrika of the carbon was during the day, we're allowed to bring up to the mizbeach certain parts of the animal, of the basar, to be burned at night. And the pasuk hi ha'ola is a mute, and it's telling me that if the offering part goes up on the mizbeach, then it should remain there and be burned. But even if the part of that carbon came from a carbon that was possible, nevertheless there's kiddush al yidei mizbeach, and therefore the mizbeach is machshir the carbon for sreifa on the mizbeach, on the eish of the mizbeach. And there are three terms that are exclusionary, are mi'utim in this pasuk, that teach us that even if the carbon is possible, nevertheless, if it was brought on the mizbeach, kevan sha'ol lo yered, it remains there. And the pasuk zos is an exclusion, meaning zos means it's ola but not yored. even though it's a carbon puzzle. And the word he is also an exclusion, only he. And the Hey of Ha'olah is also an exclusion. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to learn that these three exclusions exclude three types of karbonos puzzle. If the shechita was done at night, if the dam of the carbon, after it was collected in a mizrach, it was uh, it, it spilled, so there was never a zrik on the mizbeach, and a carbon where the dam was removed outside of the azar. In all these three cases, the parts of the animal that were illegally placed on the mizbeach, yardu, they have to be brought down from the mizbeach. Ibois ema. The Gemara now offers another possible argument from which to derive the conclusion that the first brisa, which says he's potter, is to be attributed to Rabbi Yehuda. Adayin ani omer lo motzis mukmas la Rabbi Yehuda, Katani, because the brisa says that rov kahol shechatu bezdin mevian alitem par. Now, if the majority of the Kahal sinned, then Bezdin is going to bring the par. The Rabbi Yehuda ha'omar tzibur huda maisi. Rabbi Yehuda has a shita that the par is not brought by the Bezdin, but rather it's brought by the tzibur itself. But Bezdin lo, it's not Rabbi Yehuda omer shiva shvatim shechatu. If 7 out of the 12 shvatim sin, meviim shiva parim. Each one of the shvatim has to bring its par. So you see that the chiv of the par is not imposed on the bezdin. Bezdin should only be chayv one, but nevertheless, each shevet is called a kahal, and when the Torah says that the kahal has to bring the par helim dovashal tzibur, it's referring to the shevet. So therefore, that second brisa, which says that it's the bezdin that brings the par, that cannot be reconciled with Rav Yehuda, who holds that it's the tzibur, or even each shevet in itself brings the par. Now we have a shita of Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel that agrees with Rav Yehuda that the Mishnah is not a stam Mishnah, but rather it should be attributed to not Rav Yehuda as, not Rebbe Yehuda as Rav Yehuda the Amoris said it was, but rather to Rabbi Meir. Zu divrei Rabbi Meir, and Mishnah that a person who acts based on the erroneous ruling of the Bezdin is potter from his own personal chatos, that reflects the sheet of Rabbi Meir. Rav Chachamim omrim yochid shasabo ros bezdin chayev. So if an individual relies on the incorrect psak of bezdin, then enochinami he would be chayev. That's the shita of the Chacham. So the Gemara says, "My Rabbi Meir, my Rabbana." Where do we find this machlok between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim that Shmuel says our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Meir? To Sanya, we learned in a brisa, Horuvi Asu. No, it's not only did Bezdin hand down a decision, but they acted in accordance with their own ruling. Rabbi Meir poter v'Chacham mechayven. Rabbi Meir says that the members of the court who acted in accordance with their ruling, those members of the court are potter. Chacham say the chayv. Now, offhand, we don't know exactly when it says, they acted according with their own ruling. what exactly does that clarify? It says Chacham Mechayvim. So what are we saying? Chacham Mechayvim means that the members of the court are chayiv to bring their own chatas, yoch, the personal chatas, or is this a reference to Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur? My man asu, right? The Bryce says Horu vi asu. Ilem bezdin. If it's the members of the court, that's the way we understood it. My time the Rabbanan the Mechayve. Why would the Rabbanan say that the members of the court who acted in accordance with their ruling would be chayiv a carbon? V'asanya, we learned in the Brisa, Yachol horu bezdin v'yasu bezdin. Yachol yuchav. I might think that bezdin that ruled erroneously and they acted out in accordance with their ruling should be chayiv. Talmud lomer hakol v'yasu. Right, the Torah says in Vayikra, Perik Dalid, Pasuk Yud Gimel, V'im kol adas Yisrael yishku v'nelam adov me'enei hakol v'yasu. Is Maisa Toli Bekol Vora Tli Bebezdin. So it says Hakol Asu. So who actually followed and implemented that erroneous decision of the Bezdin? It was the Kol. And it's only the Hora that depends upon the Bezdin. So therefore, had Par Helim Dov Tzibur is only brought when the public was guilty of, like we said before, eating the chelev, and not when, the only ones who ate the chelev based on the erroneous decisions of the court were the court members themselves. So we can't say that when it says hakol v'asu in the previous price, it's referring to the actions of the court, because then we cannot explain why the chachamim require a parahelim davashal tzibur. Ella horu bezdin, rather what the Brisa has in mind is that the court ruled v'asu rov kol, the majority of the congregation acted based on the erroneous ruling and the ate the chelev, and the machlokas tanoim, whether or not the parahelim of chov tzibur has to be brought in such a case, and that's not acceptable either. My time of the Rameh the Poter. Why Rameh say a poter from a carbon Par Helim Davashal Tzibur was the case of Asurov Kol. That's the classic case for which the Torah establishes a Par Helim Davashal Tzibur. So how can we justify Reb Meir who says that there's a ptur elalav? We have to be talking by process of elimination with Horu Bezdin V'Yasu Mira Kol, where as a result of the court ruling, only a minority of the Kol ate the chelev and acted out based on their ruling. But hakamifli, Marsav according to Rabbi Meir, Yachid Sha'asa Boraz Bezdin Potter. That if an individual acts out based on the erroneous decision of the court, then he doesn't bring a chatos. He's not begetter shogeg for a personal chatos. Umarsav, but the chachamim hold Yachid Sha'asa Boraz Bezdin Chayev. That in an individual who relied on the court with the court's toes, the erroneous decision, he has to bring a carbon yochid. Our Papa says, this is not necessarily the plugta, the point of the machlokas here. The kuliyama could be that everybody agrees, even the chachamim, that Yochid Sha'asa Boros Bezdin Potur, right? He relied on the mistaken ruling of the Bezdin, therefore it's not considered a shogeg. Ela Bezdin Mashlim Rov Tzibur Kamiflagim. The machlokas is whether in a 50-50 situation, can the members of the court themselves, if they acted out based on their own erroneous decision and they ate the chela, can they be integrated in order to tip the scale in favor of the majority? Can we calculate that? Marasavar, according to Chachamim, Bezdin Mashlim Rov Tzibur, there's no reason why we shouldn't add the members of the court to tip the scale and create a majority of the Kohol having violated the Iser Karis of Chelev, and therefore there will be a chiyuv of Parahel and Dovashal Tzibur. Marsa, Rabbi Meir holds, Ein Bezdin Mashal Rov Tzibur. The members of the court themselves cannot be integrated to the number, the calculation, to create and generate a rove and be mechayev a carbon helam dovashal tzibur. But everybody agrees, and there was never machlokas, argues Rav Papa, that there's no chatas yachid because the people are relying on the erroneous decision of Bezdin. Iboy same another shot in the Hezber, in the beer of the machlokas in the Brisa. Horu Bezdin v'asurov shall call. The debate revolves around the case where it was a ruling of the court. Enochinami, the majority of the congregation implemented that erroneous ruling. Man chachamim, Rabbi Shimon, the Omar, Sibur Maise u Bezdin Maise. That in the case where the Rov Tzibur violated that Isur, relying on the decision of Bezdin, then there are two karbonos that have to be brought. One is the Helen, Par Helen Dovashal Tzibur has to be brought by the Bezdin, and number two, the Tzibur likewise has to bring a Par Helen Dovashal Tzibur. So it's like Bezdin is one entity, and the Tzibur is another entity. And in the case where both of them relied on the erroneous error of Bezdin and violated the Isur Chelev, they have to each of these two entities, so to speak, the Kahal on its part and Bezdin for their part, have to bring a Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur. So when Rav Meir says Potter, he meant that the Kahal is Potter from bringing a Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, because Rav Meir's opinion is that it's the Bezdin, not the Kol, that brings a Par Helim Dov Tzibur. So that's what he means, they're exempt. Bezdin is the one who's chayiv to bring the Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur. But Reb Shimon disagrees, and he holds no. There are two independent chiyuvim of Par Helim Dov Shel, one on the part of the Bezdin, one on the part of the Kol. Ibai, same the Gemara has now a third explanation of the controversy here in this brisa. Shevet she'asaboros bezdino. Every shevet had its own bezdin, and the bezdin of that particular shevet issued an erroneous ruling, and the shevet followed suit and ate the chelev. Uman chachamim, and which of the chachamim, of the Tanoim, was accepted by the chachamim? Rabbi Yehudi, the Sanya Shevet she'asa boros bezdino, HaShevet Chayev. So that was Rabbi Yehuda's shita, that the chiyuv of Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur is incumbent upon the tzibur that violated the Isur Chelev by relying on the erroneous decision of Bezdin, and therefore the shevet becomes a separate kahal, and if they, probably the majority of them, violated the Horas Bezdin that was betos, they have to bring a carbon, because the chiv carbon is on the kahal. Ibai, same a fourth explanation of the machlokes in this price kagon shechatu shisha vehein bein rubo shel kol. Right? Let's say you don't have the exact same members of each one of the shvatim, so you could have 6 of the shvatim, but they make up majority of the kol, or just the opposite. Shiva, you could have 7 shvatim that violated an Isur Kares based on the erroneous ruling of the Bezdin. V'afal pisha enom rubo shel kol. And therefore there would be no chiyuv of parad helim davashal tzibur because you don't have a rov here, even though you have 7 out of 12, the majority of the shvatim. But nevertheless, in terms of the populations of the shvatim, it's less. The totality is less than rubo shel kol. Umasnisim mani, and which view of the Rabbanon is reflected in the Brisa? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Omer Mishmo. Now, what does Mishmo mean? We'll see in a minute. Chatu shisha v'heim rubo shall call, o shiva fal pishaino rubo shall call, chayovim. That there are 2 possible machayvim in Parahelim Dilshover. Each one is a machayv unto itself. Number 1, rubo shall call, even if you don't have rov shvatim, or the majority of the tribes, even though you don't have rov kol. In both cases, you're chay. So the Chacham of our Brisa accept that view that one of these 2 machayvim is enough to generate a chiyuv of par helim dovishal tzibur. Rabbi Meir holds, on the other hand, that we need both conditions to be filled. It's not either or. You need either the majority of the tribes, and in addition, you need the majority of the population. When you want to calculate whether the majority of the kol has violated the Iser Kares by relying on the erroneous decision of Beis Din, then you only calculate those Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael. Shenemar, and we see this from the Parsha of Chanukas, Hamigdash Rishon Shel Shlomo HaMelech. In Molachim it says, Vayash Shlomo Beis Ahiyas Achag, Bechol Yisrael Imo Kol Gadol, Milavo Hamas Ad Nachal Mitzrayim L'fnei Hashem Elokeinu Shivas Yomim V'Shivas Yomim Arba'asar Yom. So when the pasuk refers to Kahal, it refers to the Kahal that is inhabiting the land from Avo Hamas till Nachal Mitzrayim, north to south, L'fnei Hashem Elokeichem, and they will participate in this celebration. But we see clearly that Kahal is a term that refers to the inhabitants Levo Hamas ad Nachal Mitzrayim, meaning Eretz Yisrael. Michti. So Ravasi now develops his proof. Ksiv v'chol Yisrael imo kahal gadol. And what is this kahal gadol? It's Milavo Hamas ad Nachal Mitzrayim. And why did the pasuk have to mention these boundary lines from which the call came? Lamali Shmamina. It's coming to teach us Hani Hu de Ikre Kol. The Jews that live inside Eretz Yisrael are called Kol. Aval Hanoch. But the Jews who live elsewhere are not called Kol. So we see that the concept of Kol is a union of Jews, and as Rameir Simcha B'Disko always says, that union of Jews can be generated in a very profound way by Eretz Yisrael. Pshita Merubim Nismatu. Now the Gemara gives us cases that are simple in order to introduce cases that will end up in Teku. We don't know the final answer. So if they were Merubim at the time that they, meaning the majority of the Jewish community, violated the Isur Chelev, relying on the Beis Din, and then Nismat, then they decreased in number, and now it's the time to bring the carbon. Hainu Plukta, the Rabbi Shimon Rabbanon. On this we have Machlokas Shimon the Rabbanon. And the Machlokas revolves around what's the Machayev that clinches the Chiv Helem Dovishal Tzibur. Is it the time, the moment of the Avera, or is it the moment of bringing the carbon? Now, this machlokas between Reb Shimon and Rabbanan is really the subject of a Mishnah later on at Daf Yud with regard to the unique chatos karbanos that are brought by the Kohen Gadol with Nasi. When there was Mashiach of the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Gadol then went ahead and he violated a chiyuv kares through an oversight of a matter of law, then he brings what's called par kohen Mashiach, a certain bull offering. When a nasi commits an avera, he brings a sa'ir, and that's called sa'ir naz in Vayikra Perek Daled. Now, these karbanos replace the standard chatas of a female sheep or goat that's brought by the rank and file citizens and members of Klal Yisrael. The Mishnah Daf Yud addresses the issue in which one of the card-carrying members of Klal Yisrael committed an avera, which is mechayev chatos, and then that individual, mipshutei ha'aham, was elevated to the position of Nasi or Kohen Gadol before he ever brought the carbon. The Tanakama, or the Rabbanon, hold that he has to bring an ordinary chatos because the mechayev is the avera, and at the time of the avera, he was a commoner, so to speak. He has to bring a regular or classic chatos. He was now appointed as the Nasi, the Kohen Gadol. It doesn't matter. Everything depends upon the moment of the chet, of the avera. However, Reb Shimon disagrees, and according to him, it all depends on Yediyah. When did he find out about his sin? If he found out about his sin before he was Nimshach or appointed as the Nasi, then he brings a regular chatos. If, on the other hand, he only finds out about his sin after he was appointed, then he's potter. So in other words, the Chachamim say that the Avera locks it in, whereas according to Reb Shimon, no. It's not the Avera. What we need is the Yediyah. Now, in our case, where the Rove later were Nismatu, they were reduced to minority, that should be compared to that machlokas between the Chacham and Reb Shimon on Daf Yud. Because that chatos depends upon the time it was violated. That's according to the Chachamim. And if the sinners comprise the majority of the kal at the time that they sinned, then they're chayev. That regular commoners chatos, even though now they are either a Kohen Gadol or a Nas. Reb Shimon, on the other hand, says that it all depends upon the Yediyah. At what point did they find out that they violated this Iser Kares? If they found out about it and yet they were still a majority, then he agrees to the Chachamim, they're liable to a parallel of Tshuva, but they only became aware of the sin after there was a miut and nismatu, then he would say that they're exempt because everything depends upon the Shas Yediyah. So now the Gemara wants to know whether or not, in the case of Muatim and Israbu, should we say that it is dependent upon the Machlokes, Chachamim, and Reb Shimon? Mi pligi Reb Shimon. For Rabbanan, the Gemara says, Reb Shimon diazul basu yediyah machayev. In other words, at the point at which those who committed the chiyuv kari, so they ate the pishtan, I'm sorry, they ate the chelev, they were the rov, is then the chayev, because that's when they found out about it. So that you did. Rabbana the Azli Basar Chatos Patre, according to the word Chatos here doesn't mean a carbon, it means the chet. And the determining moment, according to Rabbanan, the critical moment is that in which the chet was violated. And therefore, in this case, there's no chiyuv carbon helim davishal tzibur because the chotim were only a mute at the time of the Avera. So that would be the argument in favor of the analogy. So the Rabbanan who hold that a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi is chayiv an ordinary carbon chatas because at the time of his violation he was a rank and file citizen. In our case, they would say that a paradel helim davishal tzibur is not called for because the sinners did not constitute a rov at the time that the sin was committed. And that's called mu'atim v'nisrabu. So at the time of the commission of the sin, they were mu'atim. And therefore, there's no chiyuv carbon helim davishal tzibur. But according to Reb Shimon, the Machayev is yediyah. And now, before they bring the carbon, there was yediyah. So they were already nisrabu, and therefore that yediyah should be Machayev a carbon. A par helim davishal tzibur. Oh, lo. Well, the Gemara says that there's no justifiable analogy between the cases. In the case of mu'atim v'nisrabu, that's not similar to the case of a rank and file Jew who became the Kohen Gadol or the Nasi. In the case of a rank and file Jew who became a Kohen Gadol or the Nasi, the Avera was implemented at a time which generates a chiyuv chatas. Does that chiyuv remain when his circumstances change and he becomes a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi? That depends on this machlokas. But in the case of a minority that became majority, here the sin was implemented at a time when there was no chatas liability. Because we're holding now that in the case of a minority that violated the Isur Kares Bishogig by relying on the erroneous decision of the court, they are potter from a chatas. Can we generate a chiyuv par helim davishal tzibur when the circumstances change? I don't know. There was never a chiyuv to begin with, and therefore the cases are not analogous. My v'tizbra. Now the Gemara is going to argue that there's no fair analogy here. Amor de shamet lady Rav Shimon the Yozel Basa Yediyah. Rav Shimon adds Yediyah into the equation to be mechayiv the carbon helim davishal tzibur to have Yediyah v'chata b'chiyuv. If both at the time of the chet and at the time of the Yediyah sachet there was a mechayiv. For example, the Kohen Gadol or the Nasi realized this sin, he had Yediyah before he was elevated. And therefore there's a full-fledged chiyuv chatas both in terms of the violation and in terms of the Yediyah. But if the realization of the Yediyah sachet took place after he was elevated to the status of a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi, then a regular, ordinary chatas yochid would not be required because you don't have both the transgression and the awareness at a time when an ordinary chatos is applicable. Because they only had Yedias HaChet after they were appointed as Kohen Gadol or a Nasi. Yedia below Chato Mishametle, did we find any source that would indicate that according to Rav Shimon, Yedia itself could create a Chatos even without a liability at the time of the Avera, the time of the transgression? Dim Kain, Laisiki Hashta. If you're going to say that according to Rav Shimon, the only factor to be considered with the only Mechayev is the Shas Yediyah, and at the time that he had the Yediyah, he was a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi, then, if that be the case, he should bring the Chatos, that special Chatos, that applies to a Kohen Gadol or a Nasi. Rav Shimon only maintains that he's exempt from both a Chatos Yochid and also from the special Chatos of a Nasi or Kohen Gadol. Ella, therefore, we have to conclude that Rabbi Shimon Chatov v'Yediyah boy. There are two mechayvim in order to determine a chiyuv chatos. It's number one, the moment of the avera, the chatah, and number two, the moment of Yediyah.